Hey, good morning and welcome back. Today we'll be talking about the city of Denver, which was a passenger train on the Union Pacific Railroad that ran between Chicago and its namesake city, Denver. This train was one of UP's famed city fleet and competed directly with the Burlington's Denver Zephyr and the Rock Island's Rocky Mountain Rocket. The city of Denver was more or less one of the secondary city fleet trains. It was above the more regional trains like the Butte Special or the Utahn, but it was definitely below the city of San Francisco, which was its least favorite transcontinental city train. And also this will kick off a quasi-series about the trains that ran in and out of Denver the days before Amtrak, as per usual on this channel. So before we get into the history or talk about the city of Denver itself, we need to talk a little bit about Colorado as a state and or territory. They wanted a rail connection pretty much since the time railways were getting going, so in the 1850s-ish. And at the time they were hunting for a railway, there really weren't that many railroads that ran west of Chicago, or at least any significant length west of Chicago. The discovery of gold in Colorado in 1859 was one of the first major lures that Colorado had to try to lure a railroad to the state. At the time, Congress was arguing over the fate of the first transcontinental railroad, and this debate continued until 1862 when the Pacific Railroad Act was passed by the states that remained within the Union. The act chartered the first transcontinental railroad between Omaha and California. Business interests in Chicago wanted the connection to be at Omaha, but other Midwestern cities also tried to, finagle their way into it, but Chicago won out and became the city in the American rail network, or at least the east-west gateway. I mean, there are secondary cities like St. Louis and Kansas City, and a few others actually do act as gateways, but Chicago is the main one, which is kind of dumb because redundancy is necessary in a transportation system, but it's subject of a different video. Denver and the cities around it wanted a connection to the Transcontinental Railroad as it moved west, and they tried their damnedest to get the Transcontinental line routed through Colorado. The Union Pacific did surveys of the state in the 1860s due to the slowdown in construction during the Civil War. During its worst 2 years, for the record, the UP only laid 40 miles of track. They concluded that building the Transcontinental Railroad through the Rockies would be next to impossible because they would need to build a 3-mile tunnel, and at the time that was something they didn't deem possible. And also for comparison, because the Northern Pacific did drill pretty long tunnels through the Cascade Mountains, they didn't do so for another 20 years at this point, because I do believe the Northern Pacific had been chartered, but it hadn't really started construction at this time, so they benefited from experience and slightly better technology and knowledge. So this long tunnel that would have been needed in Colorado is what pushed the Transcontinental Railroad to be run through Wyoming and only dipped through Colorado at Julesburg. And also at this point, Colorado's mining industry had gone into a recession, so a line to connect the mining parts of Colorado wasn't really attractive to the Union Pacific. The first major push that actually started materializing to get a railroad to Denver was the Kansas Pacific Railroad that promised to build a connection between Kansas City and Denver. Construction commenced and proved to be slow, which meant businessmen in Denver didn't believe that it would actually happen and that the business itself didn't want to complete the line. Because at the time, there were a lot of shysters going around raising money and disappearing into the night with paper railroads and whatnot. Also, around the same time, businessmen in Golden, Colorado were attempting to entice the UP to build south from Cheyenne to Golden. This plan fell through because the people of Colorado would have had to have paid for grading work because the UP was barred from doing so until it completed its connection to the west. And this was in 1867, so trying to get the timeline down to more or less where it's supposed to be. Since Golden's businessmen couldn't sell the other counties on the railroad, it was never built. And the last and final attempt to connect Denver to the world was the Denver Pacific Railroad. This line would run north from Denver to what's now Greeley and then on to Cheyenne. This worked because they were able to secure a land grant from Congress, which helped them with the financing, and the UP ended up building the line, which again wasn't 100% legal because this was the earlier part of the 1860s, and corruption at the time, basically. Things could get swept under the rug because of that. More so than now, as bad as now is. Part of the exchange was that the UP would get a controlling interest in the Denver and Pacific, and in the summer of 1870, the line was completed to Cheyenne, and also in that time frame, the Kansas Pacific finished its line between Denver and Kansas City, and also the Kansas Pacific eventually got absorbed into the Union Pacific as well, just as a for instance and for record. So I'm going to go out on a very solid limb and assume that there were passenger and mail trains running the rails between Denver and elsewhere in the UP system before the launch of the trains we'll be talking about today. Most railways at this time ran trains, usually made of wood, and eventually upgraded them to steel heavyweight equipment. There generally wasn't a whole lot recorded about these passenger trains because at the time getting the railway built was the thing of historical importance, so more has been recorded about that. They mentioned this a little bit in the City of San Francisco video that, yeah, some was recorded and there was some history about the first trains on the overland route, but in my digging, that seems to be more of an anomaly than a standard thing, so we're just kind of rolling with there were passenger and mail trains, but they just weren't very, interesting. Not to mention, passenger trains at this point were basically just boxcars with benches and windows and something-fired stoves, and then that would catch on fire if the train crashed. So we'll mostly be talking about the city of Denver and its predecessor, the Columbine. But before we get into that, there are some clarifications I have to make. In the past videos about the city fleet trains, so the LA, the San Francisco, and the Portland, I failed to mention that some of the trains that ran those routes had sections that went to Denver and on to St. Louis. These trains being the Los Angeles Limited, the Overland Limited, the Portland Limited, Pacific Limited. Pacific Limited had a few different names through its history, kind of like the San Francisco Overland did. So depending on what schedule and what year you're looking at, the name might be different, but the schedule might be the same because inconsistency was a fun thing back then. The Pacific Limited also had the distinction of splitting into 3 sections and going to LA, Oakland, and Portland, and I may or may not go over that in more detail whenever I do the City of St. Louis, or lump the City of St. Louis and all the other non-city fleet trains that I haven't talked about into one giant video, because that is not on the drawing board at the time. Anyways, the first train to note that ran the route between Denver and Chicago was the Columbine. This train was launched in 1926 and ran with the most luxurious equipment of the time, which included standard Pullman sleepers, diners, and what the UP dubbed a limousine lounge. As for what that meant, I'm not entirely sure. And the train launched with parlor lounge cars that were painted in the colors reminiscent of the Colorado state flag. These lounges offered many services, including a soda fountain, a barber shop, and a dry cleaning service, if I'm reading the brochure correctly. On top of this, the train also launched with new quote-unquote coach cars, which from the brochure I looked at basically looked like what would be called chair cars by most railways by the Streamliner era, or what is closer to long distance on an Amtrak train, or long distance coach rather, versus, the bench seats that would have been available in most heavyweight trains around the time. So the Columbine was like other trains that were launched at the time. They were, in a sense, kind of an in-between type of train. They were luxurious, at least compared to the other heavyweight trains that ran before World War I, but they were generally not as nice as the Streamliners, and were not Streamliners because they were still heavyweight trains. One of the things that also kind of came around at this time was that enclosed bedrooms were becoming more common, even if Streamliners were more or less known for being the debut of enclosed bedrooms. They were starting to become a thing in this late point of the heavyweight era. And the Columbine was similar to the CB&Q's Blackhawk, which ran between the Twin Cities and Chicago, that launched 4 years after, which they did launch a train similar to the Blackhawk on the Chicago-Denver route in 1930. And this is kind of a pattern. The Roaring Twenties was the launching of flashy new trains to attract riders, but it would effectively pale in comparison to the Streamline craze that came basically starting in 1934 and on through the Depression and after World War II, and the Streamline era came despite the pain the Depression brought to the railroads. Before we move on, I have been trying to make this a point of talking more about the food service on the trains, and I'll talk a little bit about the Columbine during its run, but I'll be looking at a menu from the Portland Rose from 1943. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a normal menu from the Columbine, but in the Portland Rose were sister trains that were launched around the same time for the same reason. And another side note is this menu was also subject to wartime rationing, so the menu is a bit sparse but still luxurious. The dinner menu still offered 3 full meal options that came with soup or crab and lemon juice, with a main course of either broiled salmon, shrimp omelet, or a stuffed roast turkey. This came with vegetables, bread, and potatoes, and a choice of dessert and drink. Then there was the discounted Challenger menu, which was just roast pork, quote-unquote. Not sure what that would mean, or is it just any random bit of pork, because, wartime, with the same sides and only sherbet for dessert. Also note that there aren't any alcohol choices on the menu. During World War II, distillers were required to sell their product to the government for the war effort, which meant a little of it made it out onto the private market and was really hard to come by and was probably a gray market product anyways. Also, just for the sake of the note in economics, there is a difference between a gray market and a black market. Gray market goods are goods that are legal to make and consume and whatnot, but are being purchased through a non-approved avenue. In the case of this, dodging rationing during the war to buy liquor would qualify as a gray market, and a black market good is something that's always illegal to make, have, or buy, or consume. So, drugs, basically, because we're on drugs. And also, just as another fair note, during this time, rum also became the hard liquor of choice in the United States because it was imported and not subjected to wartime controls on its sale. And also, one final note about the dining on the Columbine was that it, like the Portland Rose, had its own unique china. And this china is so rare that a coffee cup went for $1,700 about a decade ago. At the time it was launched, the UP had a standard china that was used on all of its trains, but the new trains got their own china because the UP was a measure of quality, which is frankly a thing that it and the Santa Fe would have until basically Amtrak was launched. So just a short 8 years after the launch of the Columbine, the world of passenger railroading would change forever in the U.S. The M10,000 and the Pioneer Zephyr ran for the first time and launched the U.S. into the streamline craze in 1934. This success was built on and launched by the UP, much the same way the CB&Q did with the success of the Pioneer Zephyr. As mentioned in the other City Fleet videos, after the Streamliner concept proved successful, the UP ordered more train sets to run brand new Streamliners. This was part of the UP and other railroads' push to get more people onto trains during the Depression because traffic had sagged. They even did a study, the UP that is, about how they could get more passengers, and what they heard back from the public was that they wanted more departures, which is frankly something Amtrak still hasn't learned. New equipment, again, thing Amtrak hasn't learned, and UP offered this by having lightweight cars put into its fleet, cheaper fares and lower meal prices, which was another thing that customers at the time wanted, which they fulfilled by redeploying old equipment onto the Challengers. And they also launched the City Fleet with full train sets. The City Fleet trains were first-class trains that ran on a very exclusive schedule. At first, the transcontinental trains only ran 5 times a month, which was eventually increased to 3 times a week by the time the Second World War started, and they all became daily after the Second World War had ended. The UP ran headfirst into the streamline craze by launching the M10,000, which was a married pair train set which ran to Salina, Kansas. This train had 3 cars, which was a baggage post office, coach, and a food service car. This train was named M10,000 because M is for motor car, which is for the, very unoriginal name, considering, there was the City Fleet and they were Streamliners, so anything else could have worked, like C100 for city, say C for city, 100 just for the number. But anyways, the M10,000 was so successful that the UP bought 6 more of these train sets from EMD, and the M10,005 and 10,006 were ordered for the city of Denver. These trains had an RPO baggage car section. Still not sure what to call those sections on a multiple unit. They had 1 coach car, bunch of standard sleepers, a diner, a tavern, and an observation car. The original M10,000 ran its own press trip and was inspected by FDR and was put on display for the World's Fair in 1934 in Chicago, along with the Pioneer Zephyr more or less doing the same thing. The new city sets had many features that trains before them didn't have. One of them that I found interesting from one of the brochures was that they had sections, but the sections had partitions which closed, at least partially enclosed the sections, almost making them into their own room. Another thing that they had was the baggage tavern combine, and the tavern occupied the passenger or public half of the baggage car. The tavern on the city of Denver even had a Western theme to fit the route, and the dining car also is interesting because they had a normal kitchen and a dining section, but 4 tables were reserved and marked off with special partitions and called a cocktail lounge. These types of trains quickly proved both popular with the public and mechanically unreliable. These trains were prone to breaking down, which forced redundancy into their design and fleet deployments. But this still didn't help, and even before the war, started, the UP, Chicago Northwestern, and Southern Pacific ordered a bunch of cars from Pullman and diesels from EMD to replace the train sets that ran on the longer runs. And 3 train sets were eventually assigned to the city of Denver to make sure the schedule could be maintained. And the city of Denver would run with this full train set until after World War II. And the Denver, as far as I can tell, is one of the last, if not the last, of the city fleet to be fully upgraded to quote-unquote modern lightweight equipment. The launch of the city of Denver did knock the Columbine into secondary status like other once first-class trains like the Portland Rose and Los Angeles Limited and the San Francisco Overland. The Columbine did get some Streamliner cars assigned to it after the war as hand-me-downs from other trains. The UP did buy a whole batch of cars after the war from Pullman and American Car and Foundry, which were used on the city trains, but the Columbine was not long for this world and it was canceled in 1950. Even with getting lightweight cars, it never matched the city of Denver's 16-hour schedule, and it was still running on a schedule nearly twice as long, even with lightweight cars. But anyways, the post-war city of Denver was more or less a standard city fleet train, but again, the UP and the Santa Fe kind of set the standard for what top-tier trains were in the West, so standard is kind of something that you have to take with a grain of salt. The UP did replace its train sets in 1953 and 54 when it ordered new cars from Pullman. This would be one of the UP's last big train orders, and the CB&Q followed suit with its own order from Bud for the Denver Zephyr around the same time. This order for the Denver Zephyr included slumber coaches, which they launched onto their competing route. And the UP attempted to compete with this by leasing a handful of 22 Rumat cars from the Pennsylvania Railroad and offered them at similar slumber coach fares. And this ended in failure mostly because the UP didn't get the ridership it needed out of their slumber service, and the Zephyr slumber coaches ran pretty much close to capacity on every run of the train. Another thing that the city of Denver didn't have compared to the Zephyr was that it didn't run with domes, and the city of Denver didn't get any sort of domes until the 60s when it was combined with the city of Portland, which had a dome liner diner. At this point, the Portland was routed through Denver and missed Cheyenne, and the reason why the UP didn't add a dome to the Denver route was, according to the railroad, the scenery was very bland, and the train ran mostly at night, so there was not really a need for a dome on the car. And even though comparatively the CB&Q basically ran domes on pretty much every train they could after World War II. And this is frankly where I'm going to leave this video for today, because the successor-ish of this route I'm going to be getting into more on the Denver Zephyr video, which is either going to be the next one or the one after this, depending on what my production schedule is, which I don't have open right now as of recording this. So just quick recap is there's no trains currently running the UP Overland route, depending on how technical you want to get with it, because the old UP portion of the line, as far as like Omaha to Ogden, there's not trains running it. The current California Zephyr runs basically the entirety of the original California Zephyr route to Winnemucca, Nevada. Then it runs the Overland route, which was technically the SP, which is also now technically the UP. So depending on how technical and pedantic you want to get about this, you can say maybe trains kind of run the UP route, but I don't like being pedantic, and that is not, honestly, that's honestly a sign to me that someone is dishonest. So I'm just going to leave this here and hope you do enjoy and come back for the next one, which is either going to be the Rocky Mountain Rocket or the Denver Zephyr. So I will see you then.